Welcome on, welcome all back to the Champion Forge. It's been a long time, but we have finally returned. My name is Canavit, joined by Exodus and Roger, and a special guest today. Why? Who could it be on the far right-hand side of the screen? But Riot game designer, Feral Pony. Feral Pony, welcome to the stream. It's lovely to have you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So for anyone who may have slept under a rock for quite some time, and may not be familiar with your work, your oeuvre, would you mind giving us a little background on yourself?
Sure. Yeah, so hey everyone, my name is Brian Feeney, I also go by Feral Pony. I'm a game designer at Riot Games. I've been working on League of Legends for, well, since I joined about 2010, so season 1 at this point. In terms of work stuff you may have seen, I started off doing champion design, so probably why I'm here. But that was a long time ago at this point. I worked on Rumble, Graves, Hecarim, Jace, and a couple of the updates over time. So like last champion I worked on was 2012, 2013 in that era. But after that, I led the balance team for a while. I moved over, did some work on the skins team, and then I ended up being the design lead and director for Wild Rift. That's probably the most recent thing that folks may have played, which is the League of Legends on mobile and consoles. And now I'm just a fancy game design architect, as they call, which is just a fancy term for a systems designer who's working on one of the upcoming R&D projects that's unannounced.
Well, that's really cool. And of course, it would be remiss to not allow for Roger to introduce themselves on stream, since, of course, hopefully you're going to be around here for a long time, but still our viewers will not be familiar with yourself. Would you mind catching them up?
Yes, so I am Roger. Some people know me, maybe I'm also like a Twitch streamer in the making. I'm a cosplayer. Maybe some of you have seen me on my Instagram on the conventions recently. So far, I'm not as famous as him now, as him, like other side. But I hope I will be just as cool as him one day. So yeah.
That's all of our goal.
I'm not as famous as my hero. We're off to a good start. I think that's a good way to start the stream.
Oh boy. New for this season, which I'll just demonstrate a little bit now. I don't know if there's actually anything here to see quite yet. But Roger, it looks like your art feed may have gone a bit weird. But hopefully we'll get this all out in a minute. So we'll be having some live art fed from Roger's side, which will... There we go. There's our initial mannequin doll, which will definitely not be what we end up with in the end, because the concept we got here today for you all is kind of weird for a good reason. So I guess it's maybe easy to miss right in the center of your screen, but it's worth being very upfront about this, that the champion that we may get round to making today, hopefully we'll have time, is not going to be a Riot champion or ever, as to the best of anyone's knowledge.
Yeah. Also, just for full transparency here, I don't even know the champion roadmap anymore at this point, which is why we're trying to do something that's a little bit out there and a little bit wild. I also haven't worked on champions directly since 2013, 2012, as I mentioned before. Although I did some on when we remade them for Wild Rift.
So we're safe from spoilers.
Yeah, you should be safe from spoilers, but we're going into hardcore spoiler-free territory here.
So what we're going to be going through today is, first of all, some theoretical groundwork where Feral Pony is going to be taking very much the lead in explaining a lot of how, at least how things used to be done, because if you're a long-time viewer of the Champion Forge, you'll know that we've been making things up as we've been going along. And Exodus, how has it gone so far for us?
I mean, sometimes I truly believe we have hit that mark and we should definitely be hired. But at the other points, I think, especially in the early years, those were dark times, we kind of made up champions where okay, this is very fun, but is completely bonkers to the point of insane. And we're trying to find a middle ground somewhere. And if we can find a middle ground, I'd say job done. But mostly I think we sometimes try and pull from a different creative area every time, and other streams we have tried to go, okay, we're going to a little bit more from I think you called it working working up, working down from one champion where, okay, we're going to try and work with a specific mechanic and design a champion later on. So it's either of the two. And this time we've went with an absolute bonkers insane idea, but I like it nonetheless. It is, what if we design a champion that either carries a fridge or is a refrigerator just as a whole, which I think is cool to do. Note the pun.
I see what you did there.
Yay. Roger, it looks like you're approaching the more humanoid version of this fridge at the moment.
Yes. I'm not as good at drawing refrigerators as.
Is it not your specialty?
So...
Oh, did you skip the class on how to draw a refrigerator? Oh.
How very
I
disappointing.
never went to an art class.
Oh, there you go. That's the key. All right, so very funny. So a big thing for us coming into this is for season 3. So this is episode 0 because we want to come into season 3 with as much of a theoretical backing as possible. So I'd love if you could take us through in the sort of the widest, with the widest view possible. What, from Riot side of things, what is the process of designing a champion?
Yeah, of course. So, generally speaking, obviously the process has changed over time, as frankly as well it should, right? Both you learn more as you go, but also designing a champion in an era when I started where we had, I think we just hit 50, 60 champions, something in that space when I joined. You have a lot more. There's a lot more design space, right? There's a lot more. You have a lot less competition, right? You could do something like, oh, this character is long ranged, and that's good enough, right? Because you only have like 50 characters, and a long range champion probably isn't sufficient. But at this point, when you have 150 and change characters, I think, in the current roster, that's not really good enough. And you have to make sure that you have a very kind of narrow focus, and then also something that makes it distinct from the other 100 and lot of champions at the same time. So usually, when we have for like an actual product scenario, right, you'll have basically a high-level product direction, right? So that can be anything from as simple as a lane and a role, which is, hey, we haven't released a jungler in a while, or we haven't released a mid-lane mage in a while, something like that. That can be the prompt, but it can also be a little bit more specific. So an easy example here is we knew that we wanted to do like we had the Shadow Isles event this year, and so it was like, okay, actually one of the additional product constraints is, hey, we need to make a champion and they have to be tied to the Shadow Isles in some way and show off some new kind of narrative aspect of that. And you're seeing that with a lot of the champions come up more recently. I think it was blanking on the name, the little Yordle one.
Vex.
Yeah, the super cute little Yordle, right? Like that's an example of like, hey, let's take Shadow Isles in a little bit of a different direction. But that would be one of the high level direction pushes that said, hey, this champion needs to fit this particular narrative. So it can happen from a variety of sources. I don't think generally I've heard us be like, oh, we have to make a champion that has mechanic X. That almost never happens anymore. But usually what happens is you want to say, hey, we want to make a marksman, or we want to make a fighter, or whatever. Insert whatever combination of roles and lanes, just to make sure that we have decent distribution. Particularly at this point, one of the tenets of the champion team has always been, as far as I can remember, honestly, the wording has changed, so forgive me, current champion team, on the wording here. But essentially, it's not important that a champion is for everyone, but it's important that there is a champion for everyone.
Okay.
Right, like that's sort of the lens there, and so it's more valuable to have something that's resonant and sticks with a small audience that really, really loves and appreciates that character than to go purely for like, just everyone likes the champion a little bit, right? Like that shouldn't be the bar. A champion can have lovers and haters, right? But if everyone's kind of a neutral kind of meh, that's a bad state to be in.
I think that's actually a very healthy way of looking at things, because, okay, and then we're going back to our champion, but it's from research we did for certain leagues, it's very clear that there's, every time we have a meta, and the meta changes constantly, obviously, but you always have, when pro players and other players as well who have these pocket picks, which are just the champions that they really enjoy, and at a certain point they get really good and creative with, and they become at a level the best. But it's not really viable right up until it might be, and that's when these champions really shine. I think a good example that I saw was, Singed right now has kind of a high win rate, and in the country finals for Belgian League, it was a best of 5. The last game was actually won with a cinched. Sorry, yeah, it was one with a cinched. It was okay, cool. So there is that niche where some of these players who really enjoy the champion, even though he used to be very much on the negative side, can actually pick it some of the time, and that's really cool.
Yeah, I think we're definitely sort of starting to tip our toes
Yeah,
a little bit
a
here
little bit too
into
far,
sort of
yeah.
pro play. Not necessarily too
Mhm.
far. It's a very different design process, right? When you're talking
Mhm.
about designing for competitive play versus sort of like the high level conceptual element of a champion. And usually, at least for the stage that we're all at right now, these champions, and generally the stuff I've seen you do previously with champion designs, um, the pro play work would be very far at the end of the process, right?
Okay.
A lot of the things that pro players care about are not the same things that the standard League of Legends player cares about. As an example, pro players. I mean, I'm drastically oversimplifying here, right? But pro players probably don't care what the champion looks like as long as it helps them win games, right? They probably don't care that it has, particularly cool and snappy audio effects, right? Probably don't care that it has, necessarily like these like one-off cool interactive VO lines with other champions, right? That's probably not things they care about as a pro player. Now, many of our pro players are also players that are in non-pro as well, right? And so they may have overlap with stuff they care there, but the things that they're going to be focusing on are very, very different, and that's why usually that stuff kind of happens at the end. Also, a really good example here is reliability. Now, we would never design this ability, but if I could literally give like an ability that makes a coin, like I hit a button and a coin flip happens, right?
Yeah.
And there's like a 30% chance I lose the game, right?
Sure.
If I hit that button. Um, Even if that theoretically has like an overall like 55-60% win rate, pro players generally will naturally steer away from that because of the lack of control and the lack of reliability there. Whereas
Hmm.
that same mechanic may be drastically overpowered in normal queue, people are willing to kind of roll those dice. But most competitive players default really hard to reliability and consistency over everything else.
Oh,
Again,
so
oversimplifying here.
so
Okay,
just
I already have a name for the champion. If it's all right with everybody, I know we do. So
Yeah.
I
Um,
yeah, go on.
oh
oh,
no, go ahead.
So I started doing some googling. The refrigerator was invented by William Cullen. So I'd say Cullen would be a good name for the champion.
and hey, we can hit the
Sure.
Twilight crowd at the same time.
There we
Perfect.
go.
Alright. So,
Okay.
I guess just to get sort of back to our sort of to the larger picture a little bit, you mentioned that you wouldn't be designing it for professional players necessarily, just because they'll kind of just take it at its competitive aspects. Could you just
Oh, sorry. It's supposed to be, there is definitely a design phase where you do care a lot about pro play, but that usually comes in the last, I would say, 10 to 15% of development, where you're doing a lot of stuff like tuning the exact hit, like hit ability of particular missiles, balance numbers, cooldowns, all of that kind of stuff.
You're
But sorry,
tweaking the
carry
you're
on.
tweaking the numbers more. Yeah.
Yeah.
well, I mean, I think Exo's kind of touched on this briefly, but you mentioned off air a little bit about the whole idea of sort of top-down versus bottom-up design. Obviously for a
Yep.
lot of people watching, this may be their first time coming across that idea at all. So I'd love to hear you kind of explain a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, this is actually a really useful concept. In fact, it may be probably the most useful one because it's not a League of Legends specific term, right? It's a very consistent design methodology that applies across game genre, across medium, even like this happens in like board game design. The Magic the Gathering designers talk about this all the time of like a top down or bottom up like Magic set, right? It also is really applicable to champion design as well. The sort of the TLDR version is usually speaking, when you have like thematics and art and mechanics, one of those is sort of the starting place.
Okay.
And then the other one tends to sort of adopt those ideas and kind of follow suit. And so the crux of this is, do you start with a creative or artistic starting point that's generally referred to as top down, or do you have a mechanical kind of starting point? This is something like this character needs to have an energy system, right?
Mhm.
Or a particular ability or mechanic, and then the art has to basically try to adopt and fit in place with those mechanics. Both options are valid, and I've personally done champions on both sides of this. An easy example for me was Rumble was a bottom up champion, where I started with Rumble. I was like, hey, we want to make this sort of like Yordle. I think Yordle in a mech was like literally the post-it note that I had. It was like, make this character. See you in 2 months, right? Kind of deal. And in that scenario, like the very first thing I went to was all of these classic mech games and fantasies, like Mech Warrior, Armored Core, these kind of spaces. And a lot of the stuff they had was this sort of this idea of kind of pushing your luck in this heat-based system. And so that was the crux of it. I didn't have any abilities at that point. I just said I want a heat system where you can really kind of like try to push yourself to the limit and kind of like literally kind of like try to live in that danger zone. And I ended up actually calling it danger zone at that point, right? And I remember at the end of the development, I actually had the danger zone song on loop while we were trying to crank out the last of those bugs there. But then at that point, I had all these mechanics, and the artist I was working with, Owen, who was awesome, he would basically come back and be like, okay, hey, here's some stuff I think that can work with the general direction we have here. And so that was a very bottoms-up kind of approach. Some advantages there. One, if you're predominantly really worried about having a unique mechanical hook, starting with a unique mechanical hook makes that very, very easy. So if that's one of the things you're really worried about, bottom up can be a phenomenal approach. Some other things that can really help here is that you when you're really focused on how the kit plays kind of above all else, you can get some really good value from like, how does this character function from a system standpoint? Is the kit really, really cohesive in and of itself mechanically? And you're generally going to get better mechanical results. The flip side of that is you're generally going to get worse thematic and visual results, right? Because what you end up happening is you have this like really locked, rigid kit that then an artist is trying to try to like work their way into making sense. An example of this kind of going a little bit, it's not terrible, but didn't go as well as I think we wanted to, was actually Oriana. Oriana was another mechanically focused bottom-up kit where basically we had this little ball, you shoot the ball around. I think at the time it was actually, it's a Nexus crystal, and you kind of throw this ball around, but then Art didn't really know what to do with it. Right, it was like, okay, we've got this ball, and like there's some magic explosions that shoot out of the ball, and then kind of turned it into this like kind of automata kind of dancer kit, or dancer visual, which is really cool, but it doesn't really mesh with the gameplay. It's almost like it's like a separate kind of visual concept. At this point, we've seen it enough that it kind of just like melds together in our minds and kind of works. But if I was to basically just take those ideas and abstract, kind of throw them out to you, it wouldn't actually make a lot of sense. It doesn't actually fit super, super well together. So that's kind of like some of the pros and the cons of that approach. If you're going from top down, which is generally you start with either a strong narrative creative idea, or mostly, I think more often the case is you start with like a piece of like concept art that's like pretty far along.
Yeah.
Easy example here was actually Hecarim was a character that I did a top-down approach on.
No pressure, by the way, Roger. No pressure.
So
yeah,
this is
I'm
actually
just
one of those
listening.
things
I'm
where,
like, yeah, this is yeah.
And this is one of those things where we're kind of, I'll lead this kind of gently into the more current philosophy, right? Because there's definitely pros and cons to each of these. For top-down, generally want to start with like a feeling or an idea or like a concept. Like if you're talking about like a fiddlesticks kind of thing more recently, like we talked about that earlier in the pre-show, where it's like, hey, this is a terrifying champion, and really above all else, mechanics be damned, this character needs to feel horrifying, scary, and terrible to play, like terrifying to play against, right? And that's the underlying goal. And how you get there doesn't really matter, right? And that can be really powerful because it can get you a theme, a feeling, like a visceral response, or it can just really work with the rest of the aesthetics and the world and the lore. When I look at a character like Hecarim as an example, that was one that I started top down, where I actually was just handed a piece of completed concept art. When I started doing Hecarim's kit, how he looked in that initial piece of concept art is exactly how he looked in the final version, except for color.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
That was literally it. We didn't have color. We didn't know what color the flames would be and all that kind of stuff. But then obviously the final version was slightly higher rendering quality. But that was from moment one. It was like, this is the champion we're making. I got to make all the mechanics plug in and work with this kit. And so
cool.
it, and that has a lot of advantages as well, right? Like I think from a design standpoint, having such a strong foundation to start with that isn't going to be kind of moving and changing kind of randomly as you're going can be really, really powerful because you have something to kind of cement yourself to. The other side of it is it can be just a really useful point of inspiration to start with. So in Hecarim's case, I was just like, it was immediately obvious what I needed to focus on, which was a mounted character, and this has to feel like a mounted cavalry charging character above all else. And that spawned the R, that spawned the E, that spawned the Q even, where I was trying to actually capture some of that. I think my main inspiration for like Hecarim's Q is actually like it's a really bad game, but like Dynasty Warriors mounted combat, right?
Oh
where like
yeah.
you're just like mashing
Oh,
square.
Yes, I remember
like,
that specifically. Yes.
yeah, that was the feeling I was trying to
Oh,
invoke, right?
cool.
Which is this idea that, hey, this character needs to be fast. They need to be able to like basically move through these kind of like lines of infantry, and they need to basically be kind of like slashing and kind of like, you know,
Mhm.
dealing kind of harassing damage around. But the whole point was I knew because I had to do a cavalry character that pushed so much of my mechanical space into like a really healthy constraint. And that's why like trying to mirror real world cavalry charges, or at least our interpretation of historical cavalry charges, right, was very, very fast, incredibly high impact damage, and then really, really crappy sustained damage after that point, right? Where it's
Yeah.
kind of like you only really do it if you have enough of an edge or a situational advantage. Like I knew the minute that Hecarim as a character in that world, if he could ever consistently trade with like another top laner, it's just like toe to toe, the character would be absolutely broken, right? So it was like, okay, how do I
so
kind of give the
I
character
see
some flex here?
somebody else play the Total War and realize how cavalry chargers work. Nice. Okay,
Indeed.
cool.
And there's a lot of inspiration you can draw from that. And I think to for folks who are trying to use this approach, I would also recommend using video game interpretations of things, not the actual real world interpretations of things. In many cases, there's a
Okay.
few examples where real world has been super super helpful. But for the standout example was actually those little base gates that I made. That those little holes in the walls.
Oh yes.
On the base. That was actually inspired when I was looking at real world historical siege warfare in combat. And
Oh, cool.
I basically now the downside was I was looking at real world historical siege content. Like I spent so much time researching like all the different techniques attackers use, all the different techniques defenders use, and 98% of them were just horrible. Right? Sieges are unfun. No one enjoys them. It's everything from just like, well, let's hope they all die of disease eventually, to like, let's just starve them out. Right? It's stuff that's not fun in a video game. But the one that stood out to me as an interesting option was sort of they're called sally ports, but it's like a little door that kind of is like hidden on the edge of a castle wall that allows defenders to easily go in and out, but attackers can't. So that was an example where I used a real world model in League of Legends to basically give functional sally ports to defenders.
Okay, so incorporating all of that into the actual champion one and design. So a guy, so Cullen, I think we call, or I called him. So the guy-
Sure.
Her,
Sure.
her, it's she.
Okay, I call her. So okay, the way we would do that is so. I imagine Cullen, if he carries a phrase, cold obviously is going to be his main source of thematic around this kit, right? So I imagine it's either cold, either means slow, or either means ice, where ice can be a form of protection. I think one of those two is definitely something that needs to be incorporated.
Yeah. My question is, like, in what way is also like the carrier of the refrigerator? Wait, column?
Cullen, yeah.
Column. Okay. Is she going to be incorporated with the cold? Is she gonna be part of the refrigerator, or is she like the master of the refrigerator? Is she gonna be like protecting herself from the cold because she knows how dangerous or like intoxicating it can be, or did she already succumb to the coldness? Like, is she going to be like frozen arms, for example? You know, like it's going through her veins already, or is she still going with like thick leather gloves, for example? And is she going to be more of a mechanical type? You know, like she knows how to also then fix the refrigerator if it's broken or something, or is she just gonna be the type like a trinket lady? You know, who like knows she has what she has in the refrigerator, but she also has like other stuff like trinkets on her belt, or like little pockets on the pants. What do you guys think?
I'd say there are, for me at least, there are two approaches. So either it is a humanoid character that is more of in a sort of fantasy realm, or it's comparable to, for example, I mean, the obvious one is Lysandra because she's kind of made of ice, and the other one would be where it's literally sort of walking Terminator-esque character, and instead of blood, she has like coolant fluid, and it can actually be one of her abilities where she sprays cooling liquid up on someone, or where she puts it on the ground or whatever. I would personally like more of the mechanical approach because that's something that would kind of give her more of a far reach with what certain thematic things we can do.
Okay,
Forever robot.
so she is a mechanic who knows how to fix a fridge if it's broken, but she already succumbed to the coldness.
Well, I guess before we kind of go too far down this road, what I really wanted to pitch to you, Penny, was what are the, I guess, hearing all of that and having that, I'm presuming you've been part of those kind of discussions before.
Mhm.
What are the kind of concerns and kind of like areas which we should be thinking in and kind of like considering to get a compelling idea in that kind of space?
Yeah, I think the main one, like I would say, 80% of design often just goes back to goal setting and making sure you have the proper goals. So it's like, why are we making this champion, right? What's our motivation for doing it, and like, what are we trying to accomplish? Besides the obvious, we're making another champion.
Yes.
And that can really help steer a lot of these kind of conversations of should you go with a top down or should you go with the bottom up approach, because they can do a lot of different things. I didn't actually mention before, but one of the downsides of a bottom up approach, or sorry, of a top down approach, is you can often get stuck once you already have all of the abilities, right? I've actually had to see a couple of times where this is very common in top down approach, where you have a kit that satisfies the top down needs, and all of a sudden you're like, ah, shit, but I still have a passive and I still have a W, and like,
Yeah.
but the kit's done, like the kit's complete, right? Like I could just ship it as is, but I need extra buttons, and you kind of have to like almost kind of like force something in there, which can be a little bit painful. I think for this, this is actually pretty nicely, this dialogue is kind of leaning into what more modern champion design is, where it's a little bit less strictly top down or bottom up. And I should say, if you folks are interested in production schedule stuff, one of the advantages of top down or bottom up is both are faster than the approach I'm going to go into now, because it's very waterfall,
Okay.
right? You can have like somebody start and finish a concept or start and finish a mechanic design, and then the other person can just kind of like plug in and kind of work with that. The approach that more modern champion design uses is what they call the DNA process, which is basically it's a 3-person pod, basically game design, that's the D, narrative, and then art. And those 3 humans all basically get together, form this tiny 3-person kind of like exploration kind of innovation pod, where they have whatever their high level product goal is, like you're going to make a top lane mage, whatever it is, right? And then those 3 humans will all kind of iterate, explore, and innovate in their own kind of like little spaces, and consistently kind of like circle back to each other. So like in this example, Roger, if you're basically trying to be like, oh, I'm trying to have this fridge character, but I don't know, like, does it make sense if like they have like these gloves to protect them from the fridge, or does it make more sense if like the gloves are like ice itself and powering the fridge, right? Like that kind of stuff. You might get stuck in that space, and maybe X, if you're working on the narrative side of this, you might come along and be like, oh, actually, I'm really trying to explore this element of the Freljord where I'm actually like pulling cold out of the air, right? At that point, you're like, okay, that really meshes with this idea. And that kind of collaboration exploration process is more what the current champion design does. The downside, the main downside is just it's slower. Right. But at this point, we don't need to be like cranking out champions every 2 weeks. So we can kind of afford to take that time, and we're kind of better off for it. But the main advantage is you kind of get the little bit of the best of both worlds, from both a top-down and a bottom-up approach, because you at the end of it, you are able to get a very, very consistently cohesive champion
Something
that should work together from all sides.
Something that immediately springs to my mind is where you can have, for example, you have 3 abilities that have something to do with cold, and one of them, because of refrigerator, what it does is basically it takes cold from one area, heat from one area, and puts it somewhere else. And what if you have one of your abilities where it's, okay, so this is cold, this is slow, whatever, and this particular ability is thematically, she expels all the heat to a sort of aggressive ability. This can be, for example, an ultimate, where it's the opposite of Nunu, where everything is slowed down, and then the absolute zero, but in this case, she overcharges the fridge, and she has like a shield or something, or she irradiates a certain zone, where in this zone, you'll take a lot of damage over time.
For example,
Yeah.
like with a cooling liquid, like it's like spilling, you know?
Yeah, you could also do something along those lines where cooling with liquid is. She can do. You can have like a bar where she builds up cooling with liquid at a certain point, and she needs to either attack champions or do something with that mechanic. And at a certain point, when she has that bar to use that heating ability, she needs the resource of that cooling that is stacked up already. So that's sort of a resource that she needs to use for that particular ability.
Yeah, I think that this is one of those things where it's really helpful to approach a champion from a lot of different angles. So like the example that we're talking about here is like a very mechanics driven to an
Yeah.
angle where like here are the functional specifics of like how a refrigerator works, right? Of like it like basically it doesn't actually generate cool, it basically just like basically grabs and expels heat, right? Which then second order basically makes a cooling factor, right? It's more expelling heat than it is generating cool. But so that's like a very mechanics layer, and we could definitely use that, right? It's something we should be kind of circling back to and discussing, and maybe that might make a lot of sense if, particularly if like the character who's either riding or wielding or hiding inside the fridge, right, has those kind of thermal control powers, right? That
Yeah.
could make tons of sense. One caution point that I'll throw out here is what are player expectations about fridges, right? Like when people think about fridges, and again, I have not surveyed 1,000 players, like 1,000 people for this, but my expectation is that the majority of people do not think of fridges as heat pushers.
Yeah,
Right?
Yeah.
They're not just like it's like an engine that pushes heat. It's like no, you open it up and it like produces cold somehow magically, right? And like all the other stuff of like it doesn't need to get plugged in, right? There's like a lot of other things that we're probably just kind of hand wave away of what fridges work. And so there's an abstract layer here that's really important when we're talking about this is like what are player expectations for a fridge? What are the core things that if we don't deliver this, it will sort of fail to meet their expectations? And
Sorry,
go ahead.
just briefly, just to address a Vincent in the chat. So yeah, just to be clear and to reiterate this again, this will not become a Riot champion. Roger. So I think one of the ways this is a kind of a way sort of an objective I wouldn't imagine would be really in any other context here is I imagine we probably need to make the fridge look like a modern fridge to make sure that it stays as far away as possible from being
I'll just Google some fridges, like I don't know,
just
some
a side-on
brands of
fridge.
fridges.
Yeah, just.
I mean,
so,
if you just want to drop in a Google image of a fridge
Yeah.
and make the character next to it,
Do you want do you want like the American fridge, you know, with like one side is like old fridge, the other one is refrigerator? Do you want the
Ice
French fridge where it's like double side fridge and downside
It sounds like an exploration is required.
I love Rick Saga UK in the chat saying there needs to be is the light off when the door closed mechanic. Yes. That is
right. And that is like actually a phenomenal thing to call out. I actually really like that call out for a few reasons. Right. One, I think it highlights of like you don't have to overly make every mechanic that exists on your inspiration into a mechanic in game, but at the same time, that is like peak emote material.
Yes.
Right. Like if you like literally had a situation where like the fridge is sitting there, right, like and you open the door just a crack so it doesn't like trip the switch, right, and you're like looking inside, like it is actually like dark inside, right, and then at the second they open up you see the light like or like the cold blast out, like that could just be a phenomenal I don't have a better term for it, but it's basically like serendipitous moment of joy, right? That can actually add a lot of value to characters overall, and those are the kind of things that can actually be really memorable, 2, 3, 4, 10 years down the line.
So that's something we had been starting to do towards the end of season 2 a little bit more. Was I think what you're talking about there, which is that if we had a concept, trying to spend more time in our sort of design sessions, sort of thinking out what are the connected ideas to this concept that we can then bring in and have it make sense and have it, as you say, be a satisfying experience that people feel reflects that idea without it being too far off base with anything we do.
Yeah, I think a general rule of thumb, if I have to just like overly codify it, would basically be generally trying to make sure at least like half of your kit is meeting expectations, potentially even more, and then basically meet expectations first, and then sort of delight and put a twist on it after you've met those expectations. So I guess like some easy examples of expectations for me for a fridge, right? probably should have food in it in some
Yeah.
variety. A lot of different ways you can go with that, but it almost certainly needs to have some sort of sustenance food component to it. And now again, mechanically we could go anywhere with this. Like it could be you open the fridge up and you're like throwing like food at people and it's like super
Yes.
painful. Or it could also just be like, you know, the fridge like waddles over and drops and then like deposits like Bard style healing.
Like 5
you know, like
potions
food
of
on
ice
ground.
just like roll out. Like no.
I actually,
Yeah.
actually thought about the same thing where you have Bard style healing where she drops something out of the fridge and then this is a health packet, but first it needs to thaw, but then you need to make sure it doesn't spoil. So there's a Goldilocks zone to pick it up. But
I mean, that is
Wait.
literally Bar W.
Yes.
I know that's literally Bard W.
It's just like one ability where she like drops out something, and like sometimes it's like something like fruit or vegetable which like restores health, and then sometimes it's like ice cream or like a piece of cake and it
Oh.
restores mana, because like sugar gives like the rush for mana and
What
stuff.
if she
Like
can? What if she can pick up? This is out there, okay? Well, what if she can pick up the honey fruit?
Oh, and
and
store it.
store,
Yeah.
like, 2 honey
Ooh.
fruits
I like
inside
that.
her,
I like that.
and keep like 2 of them max inside her for a while, and then later on deposit.
So she doesn't need healing potions. That would be like so cool.
Mm-hmm.
So this leads us into like a couple of interesting threads here, right? That I'll try to kind of loop back. The first is sort of like when we're talking about all these different options for like, let's say we agree that food in a fridge is like a core requirement for this character, right? To meet expectations. It can be a lot of different directions, right? But I wouldn't at this point like super double down. Right, like I wouldn't. We should have like one ability that is about food in a fridge, right? If we decide that ability is about like throwing frozen steaks at people and they really hurt, that's fine,
Bonk.
right? But we shouldn't do multiple abilities around food inside the fridge, right?
Yeah.
One is probably sufficient here, and we kind of have to decide at that point. Like, and obviously, if we had the product direction, this also probably help here a bit, right? Where if we knew this was like a support character versus like mid lane mage. I would probably steer very quickly towards either a projectile-based attack or towards a more supportive Healy kind of mode.
Mm-hmm.
The other one that you kind of mentioned here is there's a few other mechanics that are kind of riffing off here. One you kind of mentioned, Roger, is like the idea of like sometimes it's ice cream, sometimes it's vegetables, sometimes it's meat, right? That kind of random element could be really, really powerful here. Now that could literally be a random. I just don't know what I'm going to do, so I throw a thing on the ground and it has like a small little bonus random effect. Or it could be as more complex as like a pick a card style system, right? Where the user has some direct input of like, do I want to drop meat, potatoes, or whatever they want to drop.
Basically cycling between the leftovers. Cool, I like it.
Right. And then the other one you mentioned, X, was the idea of like, hey, should you be able to consume and basically store honey fruit? Which is a really cool concept, and that's a mechanic that we could probably make work. The lens I would be cautious on that is like that is a cool effect, but likely too niche for an entire ability. So if you think that that's like a really cool idea and like captures some element of the fantasy and some element of like that you want to preserve, how else can that ability basically? How can the honey fruit absorption be part of a more broad ability? So a really easy example here, and this may not be good, better for the character or not, right? But we can talk about it, which is like, what if the fridge consumes things, right? Like kind of twist a little bit of the fridge always producing, but the fridge also consumes things, right? It has to consume things to produce things. And so if you have something like a Tom Kench style ability where the fridge can like eat minions, right? And like shove minions inside the fridge, but you also make honey fruit as a selectable target in that model. And so it's like, okay, well, the ability is fundamentally shove a thing inside the fridge. Right, and one of the things that you can then leverage,
like fill it up again.
Right. At that point, one of the things you can leverage is honey fruit, right? And maybe that can tie into some other ability. I'm not sure.
Or like you have to like load up the ability to like like throw out some like I don't know fruit or like meat to like restore health or mana or something. And for that you have to take in like 2 minions to like or like and then some honey fruit something. Like make it like a sick twist that the champions you're giving health to are basically like eating minions.
You could do something along the lines of like, for example, is done with the Kiana, where you have different elements within the same ability, where it's if you eat if you store honey fruit in the fridge and then you expel it later on, there is obviously the healing part. Or where if you have, as you said, you eat minions, where if you eat minions and you expel them later on, you can do something else. For example, they might become sort of traps, or they might become slowing areas because they're frozen minions.
Yeah.
So for the
Sure.
enemies, I think that something that might actually be really cool. Yeah.
Yeah. This might be a good time to kind of segue a little bit into sort of. I can't remember if they still use this exact terminology, but the through lines still hold, which is essentially there's sort of 4 pillars that once you sort of have your kit design that you want to be kind of like judging it against, right? The first one of those is what I would call basically unique inputs. It's what we used to call it. So unique inputs are essentially what is the unique part of the experience for the person playing the champion. A really good example here, sort of like best in class, would be like Kallista's passive, right? Like the act of playing Kallista feels like no other champion in the game. That core movement pattern of like attack move, and you're like leaping all around. That is a very, very unique example. There are more subtle examples that still work here, but anything that's like controls related that feels distinct, or anything that like makes you play the character differently than you would for other characters, particularly in the same role, can be really, really important. I'd say this is doubly important for characters that are in more homogenous roles, like marksmen come to mind, where it's like it's very easy for marksmen to kind of blur together, and whereas someone like top laners who have a lot more variety and sort of like moment-to-moment play styles. But if you're making something like a new marksman, it's really important to think about like why that character will feel differently. And so as an example, when I was working on Graves, that whole point was this is a marksman who really needs to get close to deal lots and lots of damage. And so that was a way to kind of twist the general play style of a marksman, even if all the other abilities still felt marksman-y. So like unique inputs is definitely a thing we want to be considerate here. We don't have to like overly worry about it at this stage. What I would generally recommend is we do a bunch of ideation, put a bunch of abilities out, and then sort of look at it and say, hey, are we meeting this goal of having this character feel distinct from other characters?
Okay, cool.
The next side of that, which sort of obviously the if you have unique inputs, unique outputs is the other one, which is essentially you can think about it as the same test, but applying to the other 9 players in the game. Does playing against or with this character alter the way you think about it? Does it alter the way that you kind of get to experience the game in a unique way? Sometimes those can be the same thing, but they don't have to be. And even something as simple as like the Bard health packs kind of modeled, like for allies, that is a very different way to sort of engage and play the game. The ally player probably doesn't care about Bard's chimes at all. Bard can run around and pick up his own chimes, and that's kind of like his own thing. So that would qualify as input. But the fact that there are now health packs that give you speed boost, and you can have little runways, and like, do I go back and try to grab that? Like, how do I play my lane differently? Do I try to like protect these or not? That kind of thing is what really kind of like checks the box for unique outputs. So those are 2 of the sort of 4 lenses that you definitely want to be evaluating a champion's success on once you're looking at a more completed mechanical kit. Is there anything you want to dive on this before I just jump into the last 2?
Not from my end.
No, I think I think definitely it feels like something we're going to be coming back to. But yeah, I'd love to hear about the other 2 as well.
Yeah, sure. So the last 2 are basically the first one is counterplay. Basically, it's like, what options does the opponent have against that? That one shouldn't be super shocking. There is some nuance here in kind of like what constitutes as counterplay and kind of like how many steps of counterplay is appropriate, right? We're generally looking for 1 or 2 steps of counterplay, not 3 or 4 or 5. It's not like, okay, I did this thing, I counterspelled it, I counterspelled your counterspell, I counterspelled your counterspell, and it's like, I have no counterplay. It's like, no, that was like 2 steps ago, right? That was the counterplay. So generally we're looking at like first or second kind of order operations here. So it's stuff like, okay, I shot a spell and I was able to like dodge it or avoid it, or I used an ability and there's like a really heavy cooldown window that I can exploit, right? That kind of thing is usually more we're looking for counterplay than like.
Well, what could be counterplay in this? I am kind of sold on this idea, but as you said, maybe it's better to not hyper focus and hyper be sold on something. Is or the mechanic where you say, okay, so you have we can even call it leftovers, but you have the stuff that she stores in the fridge, whether what that mechanically is, but to give that form of counterplay is the more that is stored, the heavier. So it also the less movement speed she will have. You can say, okay, let's do give it a small debuff where, and obviously this is just hypothetical. This is not fixed numbers or anything. Where with every item you have in your fridge, you get -5 movement speed, which is not a lot, but it stacks up really quickly. If you have 10 items in there, all of a sudden, wow, you're slow as hell, and there's not really anything you can do.
Yeah, so that's definitely an option here for
Yeah.
sure, right? Like that would definitely meet this criteria. The interesting thing about counterplay, I think more so than the other aspects, is I think the problem here is actually identification more than solution generation. It's really trying to like look back and say, okay, as this champion is playing and as like they kind of interacting with their lane opponent, what options like I guess you can start identifying those problems of like, do we have a counterplay problem here? Do we need to add more counterplay? Is there too much counterplay? That also can happen, where something becomes and feels unusable. But as an example, like if we have this leftovers move, there's all sorts of different things we could do to add counterplay. And some of this gets into a more nuanced conversation of what types of counterplay are we talking about? Are we talking about like more like moment to moment, like mechanical counterplay? That's like okay, I clicked this way and stepped out of the way, or is it more strategic counterplay? Like I had to make a different decision based around this kind of concept.
Yeah.
So your example of I get slower and slower and slower, that's really more strategic counterplay, where it's not a bad thing. I'm just saying it's not the same thing as like I'm gonna like dodge the skill shot. It's like oh, I can't roam now if I want to go help my top laner who's like really hungry, right, or low health in this scenario, and I'm like I fill my fridge up and I'm like waddling over to top lane, I'm never going to get there, right? And so that's sort of like the balancing act of like how much food do I want to deliver to people. That's an example of strategic counterplay there. And there's a lot of mechanics we could do here. We could do, you already mentioned like food spoiling as a counterplay mechanic. It could be anything from like I don't actually generate food on myself. I have to like like grab and brutally butcher a minion into minion steaks, right? Like that could be the counterplay where it just says you have to get within range of enemies to actually trigger this kind of mechanic. There's, I would say, probably a dozen that we could come up with very, very quickly. But it's definitely a lens that we want to be using once we have a play pattern established, and once we kind of feel like we know what the character is doing. And then I guess the last one, just for the sake of wrapping up the 4 points, is strategic identity, right? This is one that's actually very, very important for pro play. So I mentioned earlier that generally we don't design for pro play, like at this stage of champion design. This is the one exception, right? Where basically we're saying like in abstract, like in the champion select stage, like regardless of what's happening in game, right? Why would I pick this champion over other champions? What does this champion bring that either alters my team comp, alters the way we think about taking objectives, anything like that? So strategic identity is also really important. It can be one of the trickiest ones, but it does have a lot of value when you nail it. It's kind of one of those moments where like you're watching the pick ban phase in like a pro game, and when you see someone like select a champion and there's like a response from the crowd,
Yeah.
almost certainly is an example of that designer really nailing the strategic identity of that champion, right? Because you anticipate something is going to be happening here that wouldn't have happened if another champion had been picked.
Yeah, I guess the thing that comes to mind there would be something like Silas or something along those lines.
Or when you go, where you suddenly have a very different, like a very high impact champion. An extreme example would be all of a sudden somebody picking Yi in
sure, yes.
Worlds, where it's like, okay, yeah, we're gonna see something, good or bad, leave it at that.
Right, you know something is going to change in the way the players are playing the game and sort of the plan. And I guess a bad example of this, again, I have not actually followed pro play in the last year and change, so I'm horribly out of date here. But like an example here would be like classically, like I don't know if and may still be a problem, I don't know, like Lulu being able to be played in every single position, right? As an example, historically is a bad example of strategic identity, where it's just like there's really no story that's being told, right? When you pick Lulu, it's like who the hell knows what's going to happen here, right? So that's an example. Like I love Lulu, but on that level, strategic identity, it's a bit of a miss for me.
You can kind of say that Karma, for me at least, fits something similar, where Karma is being played in such a plethora of ways, but there is a distinct lack of being in a certain niche with Karma, where it's
Right.
okay, and Karma is a jack of all trades, but this also means that she can, or used to be played at like literally every lane. But at the same time, it's not that you have, wow, Karma has this one thing that's really cool. Where it's kind of Karma does a lot of stuff.
It's a common problem with whenever you're designing a jack of all trades character. I would definitely be very, very cautious, right? And this is really part of the reason that you're identifying as to why. I think one of the other things that's relevant here to call out, particularly for jack of all trades characters, is the context around the character matters a ton. If you only have 30 champions, a jack of all trades character can be really strategically interesting. When you have 160 characters, a jack of all trades character is kind of a nightmare.
Yeah.
Because basically there's nothing that really makes that character super, super unique and distinct. And the other problem is once you hit 100, like a lot of characters, you're probably going to have multiple jack of all trade characters. If you have more than one jack of all trades characters, it's just not going to be a unique identity at that point. So that's another kind of area of caution, is like, what's the ecosystem and the context around the character.
Oopsie. I have one question just to throw it in there to like bring something line up. Do I make the fridge? Oh, why did
we've lost your
stop?
yeah, we've lost your RP.
Okay,
There we it's coming back slowly.
something is.
Epilepsy warning for our viewers.
Sorry. There we go. Is the fridge a special brand, a specific brand? And if yes, do you think we can get some funding for that?
Maybe do we have any
placement?
Do we have any fridge experts in the chat who can?
I think it's fair to say this is so weird, but I studied engineering, and this was actually one of our things. Let's say it needs to have at least lore-wise an A++ rating as energy efficiency.
Okay.
So I while that question is somewhat trolly, I will say that I think there's some stuff you can actually seriously rip off of this. So first and foremost, if I was to basically be judging this as like a super serious champion concept, right? One of the core concepts that you always have to be careful of is like just cognizant of is what is the champion's source of power, right? In this scenario, the source of power is the fridge, and so when you look at a champion's source of power, you have to really, really exaggerate that. So off the cuff, this fridge is at least 50% too small. Like, this needs to be a very, very large fridge, and it needs to basically be very obvious. There's a few reasons for that. One is just general readability, right? So if this fridge is being opened in game,
you need to see it.
You need to see it, and you need to be able to see the things inside of it. Also, if we're talking about stuff like you can shove a minion inside of it, right? It needs to be big enough to actually fit a minion inside of it.
That is big enough, right? Minion?
No.
Okay,
No.
we'll make
It must be large.
I would say not only is this fridge a little bit small from like at least my gigantic American fridge viewpoint, it also take whatever your realistic sizes for things are and then add like 40-50%. An easy example
My
here
fridge is very small, so
if you look at like other champions, an easy example here is Katarina. We talk about Katarina having knives and daggers. A realistic knife and dagger is like, like half a foot long, right? At tops for like a large knife. And if you look at like the realistic things, like proportionally, her daggers are long swords. Like if I was to actually do it, which is a two-handed weapon, like a realistic Katarina could wield one of her daggers in two hands. But to have it actually read as a dagger in a video game, it needs to be like 3x the realistic size of it. So, I would go even bigger than what you have here, right? It's really hard to understate. I'd say probably no. I would go even bigger. You probably want the fridge at least 30% taller than the.
I'll make like a note here. This is 3 meters tall.
So, Pony, one thing which is kind of occurring to me here is this. I'm getting kind of new vibes here in that with the kind of thing you're talking about with the fridge being as large as it is, it's going to be a much larger silhouette than the carrier is. So then presumably it becomes the focus rather than the person carrying it. In the same way that which one was which? Willem isn't necessarily hugely the focus when Nunu's so much bigger than them.
Yeah, the silhouette call-out is really important here. Obviously, this is like, I come from a design background, but I do a lot of work with the art team and a lot of work with champion silhouettes, and silhouettes are super, super important. This, to me, we could go a lot of different directions of. There is definitely like a Braum angle here as well that you could go where she could still be carrying it, but Braum's silhouette is still mostly Braum, even though I think his shield is actually physically taller than he is. And there's ways to cheat that with like animations where you can like change the sizing of the thing in the moment. Like, hey, it's actually like 30% smaller, but then when he blocks with it, it doesn't look like it gets bigger, but it may actually physically get bigger, right? Something in that space. So there's some tricks we can do with this. But this also is like a really good opportunity for us if we were in this sort of DNA pod style thing to think about the silhouette and what options we have. So if we think that this fridge does need to actually be this gigantic, or by my recommendation, another 30% larger than it currently is, how do we make this? How do we make
trying
this
to make it like
silhouette
fatter? Because like in the width, it can be like it can be like enormous, but like in the height, because she has to be able to carry it.
But there's a few options here, right? Like you could physically carry, you could carry it over the shoulder, like like one of those like big like Tauren totem hammers, right? From Warcraft.
Yeah.
It could also be maybe we actually think it's really cool if this character is actually inside the fridge by default, right? And it's more like that model you have where the fridge is actually physically over the character and the little feet stick out, right? And like she's like running around. The fridge is almost more like a blocky,
like a turtle
armor
shell
shield.
kind of thing.
Yeah, like
Exactly, like a turtle shell. We could also switch to a model where the fridge is functionally a mount, right? Almost more like Nunu Willump style, where like the fridge has either wheels or ice magic and is kind of moving around. There's a lot of space that we can play with here. But this is why it's one of those things where it's super, super cool to have those different disciplines coming together. And sort of to iterate and kind of talk through stuff. And we would explore a lot of those different styles. Which
something that can be cool is where because it's such a large object, obviously, where if you want to give her a form of CC besides going for the obvious with the slow, is just going, okay, I'll literally bonk you with the fridge, where she does like a if it's on her back, where she does like a if she bonks somebody with the fridge because it's so heavy, you get stunned, or at least there's an effect where it's like, okay, this is a big fridge, I get hit with it, what's the payoff?
Well, Exus, I was thinking it just kind of like to throw this idea around here, because Pony, you mentioned the idea of the fridge rider, and that really struck me. Because I was thinking of Aurelian Sol and his mechanic of gaining momentum, sort of effectively momentum by sort of moving in a certain direction for a certain amount of time. I had the idea, because I don't think I've ever heard of a champion who sort of functionally works like this, where I think it's in other games, where moving in a certain direction, you sort of gain momentum as you go, as long as you stay in that direction. And with what you're talking about with bonking people with a fridge, that could be part of it, that you can build up movement speed by sliding on the refrigerator, and if you go fast enough, when you hit someone, you just passively knock into them and knock them up.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think I could probably Google the numbers on it, but like there are probably hundreds of people that die every year from being squished by a fridge, right? It just kind of happens. Like fridges are heavy, blunt objects, and you could definitely leverage that.
I've had a little anecdote to tell, because this is actually true. So I used to work as a student job, I used to work in the kitchen for a retirement home. And I think it happened, I want to say at minimum 6 times in a span of 4 summers, where including myself, by the way, other people locked themselves in it's an industrial fridge. So it's a
the walk-in fridge, right?
Yeah, but these are death traps. These are serious death traps, because there's a reason all of these doors are. It's like, it's really difficult to close. Yeah, because you never ever want, because these get stupidly cold, -30 sometimes, and you do not want to have them close onto you, because most of these aren't actually operable from the inside. I don't know why. I know some of them even have a panic button where you can go, I am stuck in here, get me the hell out. But that has happened. Sorry, I really wanted to share that one. Sorry.
Also, I got a brand name, because there's a name, everyone knows like KitchenAid, right? This is Summoner's Aid.
Oh,
yeah,
nice.
Yeah, that works.
Belladorin said we weren't shipping this, but let's ship it.
Belladorin. Well, I think you know that Smeg has a meaning of different things in different countries, so probably wouldn't use that one. Oh boy.
Really?
I'm missing something, and I think that's okay.
Oh yeah. No,
I think it's okay.
It's a British thing.
Oh, the shipping. Oh.
No. We'll skip.
Let's move on.
Yeah.
All right. So The one of the other sort of things which we haven't really got a chance to bring up yet, we've actually been doing pretty well with getting through kind of our planned topics, is contingency planning as
Yep.
an idea. So what is
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, so this is basically another one of those steps that you want to do like after your sort of after your play style is established, right? After the core loop is good and you have a general kit worked out. This has probably been the single most beneficial process change I've seen that we do for champions in the last few years, where basically the idea is well, there's actually two layers to it, right? One is when you're doing playtesting in particular, it's really helpful to make sure that you at least have like a number of playtests where the champion is both overpowered and underpowered, clearly. And that can be really helpful for a few reasons. One, if you play the champion when they're underpowered, you get a really good sense for like, is the champion still fun? Right? Or is the champion only fun because they're overpowered? Right? Like obviously killing everybody can be fun no matter how bad the kit is. But is the champion still fun when they're underpowered? And vice versa, when they're overpowered, what does it actually look like? How does that manifest? And like, what issues are we really concerned about? Because there's a lot of different ways to be overpowered. So during your testing, it's really important to actually overtune and undertune your character. Almost, I would say intentionally. So you kind of know where some of those boundaries are, and that way you can kind of figure like, okay, I don't necessarily know where the true balance point is, but I know it's between at least A and B, right? And that can definitely kind of help guide it. But once you basically get really close to releasing a champion, and you know, hey, this champion's going to go out next week or 2 weeks from now or whatever it is, it's really valuable to kind of go through the mental exercise, which I call contingency planning, which is basically saying, what happens if the champion is overpowered? If the champion is overpowered, how do we think they're going to be overpowered, right? How do we believe that's going to manifest? And what are we going to do about it? And doing that exercise ahead of time can be super, super valuable. And do the exact same thing for underpowered, right? If this character is underpowered, why do we believe this character will be underpowered? What are the possible reasons for it? And what would we change? And that allows you to even go as far as like, you know, modern champions will actually have things where it'll basically say the championships, and there will literally be like a list of like, hey, here's what we do if the champion is overpowered, and here's what the champion will do if they're underpowered. And you can actually have that change list literally like coded, implemented, QA'd, and ready to go in both cases. And that just saves you a ton of time and be able to respond very, very quickly.
So you basically have scenarios lined up where you have potential, let's call them hot fixes from a theoretical standpoint, where you have, okay, so in this particular case, what if I think Cullen we call her? What if Cullen is just too sustainable, like sustains everybody in lane and it's bonkers and nobody dies? Let's say, okay, well, the obvious is she's extraordinarily slow and she can sustain somebody in lane, but she'll never be able to roam because it's just not doable. Or the opposite,
Right.
where she keeps going all over the map, helping out people. But does she? But how would you fix that? Where you example, you say, okay, cool. Well, let's say she can, when she helps someone, when she roams somebody, there is a certain sort of built-in cooldown or a sort of built-in place where she will have taken a disadvantage from helping that people, not being able to help somebody else, aka a fridge being empty. This is again circling back to that idea, but something else along those lines.
Totally. And you can get really, really specific here as well. So like the first example you mentioned was this character has too much sustain. That having that as like a viable option that you're talking through where this may happen can be incredibly helpful. Because at that point, what you're going to be doing is you're talking with the other designers, with your playtesting team, your QA, the game analysis team, all of those folks. You can be like, hey, here's a scenario we think is realistic that could happen, right? And if this character is overpowered and has way too much sustain, what do we do about it? Because there's a lot of different ways to do about it. And the last thing you want isn't a hot fix borderline emergency scenario on day one where a character is like running rampant over the live servers, is to have to really start getting into those debates of just like, okay, should we lower the healing per food item? Should we lower the number of food items? Should we lower the cooldown rate of like how fast food items you cover? Do we need like what's the correct course of action under this like potentially likely scenario? And getting that discussion, that dialogue, and that problem hashed out in advance is really, really, really critical. Just because you don't have a ton of time in that scenario. Even if you realistically want to like push a change to the live servers like instantly, you can't just like push a button and just say like just like let me change this number real quick and ship it. There's a lot of hurdles and pain points to getting it to the live servers, making sure it's not going to break anything else, right? Particularly if you're rushing a change, that can be really, really dangerous as well. or also making sure it goes to every region, right? We have a lot of shards of League of Legends like across the world, and so it's really important that we get this out into a lot of different areas simultaneously.
Well, this is the advantage that we have had throughout. I mean, this is because we 100% knew for whenever we designed something. Okay, this never will be a champion. This will never be released. So the advantage that we had was we always set up some. I think we always set up some stuff where this feels kind of unfun to play against, or we need some form of counterplay inherently in this kit. But we also know, well, we never need to tweak it because we can do whatever we want, and that is absolutely
Right.
something we do all the time. Yeah.
But even if you don't have to tweak it, there's still an exercise kind of before that, which is I've heard it referred to as like control levers, essentially. If you think of like a champion as like all these different buttons and switches, right? Like, and what tools available does the designer have to like fix a problem? There will be situations where if you're trying to look and say, hey, this champion maybe have way too much poke damage or way too much sustain, or like this character may just be like super unfun for varying reasons, right? Like maybe just slowing yourself all the time by eating all this food and shoving, like filling the refrigerator up is just like a super unfun mechanic. It's worth the exercise to say, if I was the balance designer on this champion, do I have the sufficient tools and options available to make the changes and fix the character?
Yeah.
That I need to. Like, do they have enough options available? Because there are definitely times where they may not, and at that point you're kind of setting that balance designer up for failure. Or that balance designer's job becomes, I have to redesign part of the kit to then do the balance, which is one, really hard and really shitty for the balance designer, and two, also just comes with a lot of player pain. At the same time, because the player is attached to a particular mechanic often at that point. And you see this anytime like a champion gets nerfed, there's almost universal disagreement that that is the correct way to nerf a character, even if everyone agrees with the concept of nerfing the character. And removing mechanics is exponentially more painful, and that for players who get sort of attached and sort of learn the play styles of a character, that's much harder than a numbers tweak or changing a cooldown or something in that space to kind of get the similar results.
Because I wanted to, I mean, I think you've sort of partially covered this already in what you're saying, but I was kind of interested in the idea of like how you would, I guess, how you would identify when it comes to needing to nerf a champion. I think further to what Exodus was saying before, that if you've got that problem with sustain, like how you identify what are the parts of the kit that you try and stay away from nerfing, even if they are maybe sort of the front runner of seeming to be problematic, and having other avenues you could explore to keep whatever you consider to be core still strong, without having the champion being overwhelming.
Yeah, it's obviously this is where design becomes more art than science. The science portion of it is that sort of universal definition of like, is this champion overpowered or not, and if they are, in what context, right? And you can often, it's not entirely, you can't entirely codify it for any places, but like win rates are an obvious example, right? Like if a character's win rate is astronomically too high, it'll probably be perceived as overpowered, right? That's usually the case. When you get closer to the 50% mark, that kind of falls apart, where you see like there will be 53% characters who nobody thinks are overpowered, and there'll be 48% characters who everyone thinks is overpowered.
Yeah.
Right. But when you're far outside of those bounds, you can kind of figure that out. So the first step is basically, does the team agree that a character is overpowered or not? Right. If the character is overpowered or underpowered, or whichever direction we're going here, the next step then is to try to figure out, okay, by how much, right? Like how far do we want to push this character? And you even see it, like one of the things I started up on when I was leading the balance team, this was 2015 or something, when we were talking about doing changes, we would put in sort of like win rate targets, to, not because like the goal is a 1% win rate or a 2% win rate. The goal was to basically set the context for how drastic a change are we looking for here. Is this change list trying to aim for like a 3 or 4% win rate spike, which would be a pretty large change on the character? Or is the character really trying to be like, this is more of a tweak to kind of like nudge them more into line? And so that's sort of like back to that goal setting and that target setting. That's what's really, really important there, is try to find how far are we trying to move this character first, because that's going to define all the tactics you use. After you know, should we nerf this character? How much should we nerf this character? Then you get into the really squishy subjective spots of like, okay, there's 4 abilities and a passive, and there's like at least 4 numbers per ability, and there's maybe more mechanics on top of that, and there's other hidden mechanics like missile speeds, right? Like all of that kind of like animation timings, all of that kind of stuff. Like what do we touch? And that's where it turns into really more of an art than a science. But all of the stuff that we've talked about so far can be looped back to it. So the easy example here is you mentioned like should we be hitting a strength or nerfing a weakness, right? Essentially. And that can really boil back to what is this character's unique strategic identity, and like what is their unique input and what is their unique output. And so what we want to try to avoid is a situation where there are situations where we do nerf strengths, and there are situations where we do nerf weaknesses and buff strengths and buff weaknesses accordingly. But an easy high level test is we have a character who wants to do a particular thing. This is usually easiest when the character is the most at a thing. So like here's a good example. Like Caitlyn is our longest range marksman. Not sure if that's true anymore, but baseline attack, and that was the feel of the character, right? And so in that scenario, we know that we want Caitlyn to be our longest range marksman. We should really avoid nerfing Caitlyn's range, even if that's what players are complaining about, right? And that's what feels oppressive about it, because that's the unique element of the character. And so in a situation like that, I wouldn't be trying to nerf their unique strategic strength. I would try to be doing something like nerf a weakness instead. Now, the exception to that is if I could nerf Caitlyn's range by a sizable amount, and she would still be the longest range character and still feel like the longest range character, that would be totally fair game at that point, because you're not removing that character's identity. You're basically saying just like, okay, this character is still the longest range character in the game, but there is too much. Right? And so maybe you're taking like a 6,000 range alt down to like a 4,000 range alt, and that still feels really freaking long.
Okay, cool. I think because let's go a little bit over what the actual kit was we're trying to do here. So we started off with potentially something where she stores stuff in the fridge, and we kind of talked about that. I think something I said before, and please, if anybody else has some input, something that could be cool is the cooling liquid, where, for example, if you spray a lot of cooling liquid on someone, you can have, okay, if you get too much onto you, you just get stunned. But if you get a little bit on you, get slowed, and the slow is bigger, the more cooling liquid you get on you. I think that's something you can do where you say, okay, this is kind of a more unique ability, but you can easily tweak numbers. You can easily change the slow. You can easily say, you can easily either remove a potential stun at the end, or just not have or just say, okay, the stun is minimal.
Sure. I think there's a lot of options here. If we want to go with like cooling liquid, I would. Sorry, just as a high level, I do have a probably 5-10 minute cutoff.
Okay, yeah.
Go in and do more game designy work for work stuff. Although this is substantially more fun, so I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes. Yeah, so if we have this basically some sort of CC kind of range spray, that could be cool. I think at this point probably most useful, instead of like really focusing on like particular mechanic or ability, like we should be kind of like hit those high level beats, right? So if we have some sort of slow base CC, seems reasonable on a fridge. If we don't have cold in some extent, it's probably not doing its job, right? We have this food consumption idea. Peter, I think you mentioned like the sort of ramming speed
Yes.
like fridge thing before, which could be really cool. I think that sounds like a really good kind of high level thing. There may be some other big beats. I think we talked about shoving somebody inside the fridge as a potential option here as well.
I got a minion in the fridge here already.
Yeah, exactly. I did see that. That was very adorable. And just because it's like top of mind right now, like that's a good example of like you would want to get actually other art folks involved at this stage. Like when your question of like what type of door should the fridge have, that's really an animation question to me more than a concept question. It's like, how is this going to read when the fridge opens, right? If you put 2 double doors, or you have that bottom tray as an example, like every one of those is going to shrink the size and the readability of the door actually opening. So if that's important, that could be a thing there as well. So
She should definitely have a voice line that when she gets a kill that says "Cool it." Sorry to completely interrupt you there, Feral Pony, but
Really?
I
That's the
just
one you want to go with, Exodus?
yeah,
All
that
right.
is 100% what I want to go with. Like on a takedown, she just says "Cool it."
I'm amazed we haven't had the fridges running joke come up in any capacity at this point.
Oh yeah.
I mean, but those are the kind of things where it's
Yeah.
like those are just delightful, right? You kind of throw those in at the end, and they're not bad to take note of because usually those kind of come from just like moments of kind of inspiration and just like serendipitous joy, as I kind of mentioned earlier. And so those are good things to like take note of and just say, hey, does this still work when the concept is further along? It may or may not, right? You mentioned like the, is your fridge running joke. If we ended up going with the kit where the character or Cullen is inside the fridge with the little feet sticking out the bottom, like that would just be flipping amazing, right? Whereas it may actually not work as well if it's like a carried fridge or something in that space.
I mean, even if
Or,
you don't
yeah.
take it as an ability that she like, or like as an actual thing that she's inside the fridge running around, we could still make it like a recall thing that she just goes into the fridge to
Right.
like cool down and then gets recalled back to base.
Right. And this is also a good example of like where we can start with something and still leverage it later. So we actually, I think I mentioned maybe and then we were talking previously. I'm not sure if it was on stream or not. Of like actually like Indiana Jones style, like getting inside
Yes.
the fridge as like a
Yeah.
shielding protection moment. That can be really
True.
powerful. An easy example I can think of now is Zareth actually used to have that ability, where basically
Really?
he could basically turn into
Yeah.
a coffin, right? And he could basically shield himself. Now,
Oh,
gameplay
okay.
wise, that didn't work very well because essentially it was like, oh, here's this character who snipes me from like across the map, and then when they get close to me, I just like turn invulnerable. Like that was just like a really crappy feeling, I think, for all parties involved. But there was something still really cool there, and so we did play with the idea a lot of times of like going into a sarcophagus, coming out of it, and even though we didn't end up putting it into the kit, it was actually incorporated into the art. And so you notice, like, for example, with recall and death animations, he will actually collapse or he'll kind of like fold in on himself and sort of form that kind of coffin idea. So that's an example of these ideas that we're sort of spitballing here, even if they're bad ideas, often can sort of worm their way into the game in a more I guess in a more usable context. So at this stage, for sure, like we be silly with it, right? That's totally fine. You can go a little crazier on the ideas. It's very, very easy often to take a crazy idea and then sort of like, like file down the rough edges a bit and get into something that's substantially more workable.
Okay, so I think given the fact we've been going for a while, and of course that you need to go soon, probably what we'll end up doing is trying to take on Cullen as a design project in a more substantial sense on our next episode, and have these sort of pieces in place for doing that. I guess.
Yeah, I think that'd be awesome.
So I guess from the rest from the other two guys, are there any final things that you wanted to float around before we call it a night tonight?
The one thing I would say is from having trying to process as much as you already said, Feral Pony, is to me, from what we said, and I have kind of been driving her mechanically, and please interrupt me, please change me, please say, Zav, you're a total idiot, which most of the time I actually am. It's very much a utility character, right? It's very much a utility character that feels sort of almost brutish, but it would be fun if you indeed had something where, okay, what exactly do you want to do with her? What's the end goal? Is the end goal for her to be so much utility but zero damage, or is the end goal for her to be she has a lot of utility but she also brings something onto the table where she can be extraordinarily hard to kill in a 1v1 or something along those lines?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess my high level recommendation, kind of to your point, and this would be for anyone in who's watching the stream who's also kind of interested in this space and is trying to just like experiment and design stuff around, is you're not implementing and chipping this character, right? So you have a lot of flexibility and a lot of freedoms to play around, to try things, to make mistakes. That's totally good and awesome. We've also talked about a lot of different things over the course of our conversation, even in terms of stuff like the top down or bottom up design, right? Those are like very different how you approach the problem fundamentally, and it can have pretty drastic implications. Also, to your originally, like, is this character a support? Is this character a tank? Is this character a melee DPS? Right? And you don't need to work on all of these simultaneously if you want to become a good designer, or someone who's even just like who's really just loves making design kits like this. These are all related but different skill sets, and like anytime you're building a skill set like this, it can be really helpful just to go through the exercise. Just say like, you know what, I don't really like top-down approaches. Like I'm more of a bottom-up kind of designer, but I'm going to do this character purely as a top down, just to do the exercise, just to go through those steps, learn where the pain points are, learn what the pros and what the cons are of that, because it's really hard to formulate a sort of a more holistic opinion without having kind of stumbled through and kind of made those mistakes yourself. The mistakes are where you really learn the most. And so exposing yourself to all these different potential avenues to make these mistakes, to make these like potentially idiotic ideas where someone can turn and be like, that's really stupid. And then you can sort of turn and be like, is it? And then that's a really interesting dialogue at that point. Is this actually stupid? Right? It may not be. Like, we've had a lot of crazy ideas that on safe face value are like, we would never do that. But the answer is, we actually might. And a lot of the crazier kits we did always started in that space. And if it is a bad idea, it's really helpful to break down and analyze why it's a bad idea. And when you start asking those questions of like, why, what are the goals, why is this a bad idea, or why is this a good idea, like, right, and you start abstracting it, you'll start finding these patterns and these through lines where you start realizing that you don't have to keep making the same mistakes or running into the same problems over and over again. You'll find that, oh, I actually already made an ability like this previously and it ran into this problem, and this basically feels the same as this other option. The other equally valid thing is if you know, for example, that let's say, it's probably a bad example, right? Pulling off the cuff, that like, oh man, I ran into this problem with sustain characters, or I wanted to build this kind of this sustain option to this fridge, and you had this problem with other characters, there's just too much sustain, or didn't have proper abilities to tune it or counterplay, or whatever the case may be. You're now armed jumping into that ability design where you know what the immediate problem is going to be, and you can basically preempt it. And sort of either try to mitigate in other ways, or at least you're aware of it. And so you're not going to be blindsided by feedback. You're not going to be blindsided by like some hole in your design. The best designers that I've ever worked with are the ones who basically are like, here's my idea, here's why I think it's good, here are all of the problems with it. Right? And we'll literally just like start off that. Like, I do that in all my design docs right now. I'm just like, and I generally get very few questions on a lot of this stuff now, because I'm just like, here are the pros, here are the cons, here are the risks, right? And it's
Have
like
fun.
any disagreements, and everyone's like, no, that makes sense.
That-
right?
that reminds
and then we
me-
can discuss individual points, but that's not usually the big problem. The spot where you lose confidence is if you can't identify your own risks.
That reminds me so much of when the Wachowski siblings wanted to pitch The Matrix. I watched a documentary on this 2 weeks ago. That's why, and he literally said, so they said they went to like major Hollywood studio, had this idea for The Matrix, which apparently was something that had been floating around in their heads for years and years, because it's very conceptual. And they had an almost 2-hour pitch meeting where they basically spent breaking everything down and then saying, yeah, this can kind of flop, but then at the same time fixing it. I was really, and apparently it's like, yeah, I think that's a really cool idea to go to look at as many faults as you can find within your own design.
So,
Yeah.
Brian, how much time have you got left? I'm imagining it's not very much.
Yeah, I could just like any kind of wrap up stuff here would be great. If there's any final questions, have anything from if there's anything from like chat side last minute, happy to answer it. But then I'm gonna roll out.
I guess so. Hopefully this can be answered quickly. Also, Belladoran, yes, the whole bringing food out of the fridge was actually the origin, I think, of a lot of the
origin.
So I guess this is more of a sort of a thing in terms of what we can do. So obviously we don't have the ability to prototype things in the same way that Riot would have, but presumably that doesn't physically happen for quite a way down the line anyway. Like how can we sort of evaluate how like a play pattern things would work, like on paper or in the context of even of these kind of streams? Is there anything we can do that would help?
Yeah. So in terms of like evaluating play pattern, generally I would recommend trying to look at who the closest parallel is, right? So like
Okay.
if this character is the closest parallel as Braum, you can start kind of basing like, okay, how does Braum work in lane and how does Braum feel in lane, right? And then you can start like really trying to drill down and say, okay, here are the 1 to 2 elements that were really changing, right? And how would that kind of change the sort of the play experience there. That's probably the easiest option. You don't have to go super crazy into like actually prototyping, implementing it, that kind of stuff. Usually we usually do a lot of that even pretty early on in champion design, but like what we usually do, even in that case, is we're not implementing entire kits from scratch and just saying like let's go for it. It's like you pick a similar representative champion and you test 1 or 2 new abilities at a time, right? And try to say like, does this basic hook work? That kind of thing. So if this character's, and the nice thing is we have 160 characters, it's pretty easy to find somebody who at least is partially similar. Yeah. So that's where I would start with.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time. Are there any kind of projects that either you're involved with or that you're interested in that you would, or perhaps you think that our viewers would be interested in, you'd like to shout out just before we end things today?
I mean, if folks are interested, I mean, again, I'm not affiliated with any of these directly, but like, I think if you're looking for other design resources, I think it's actually really helpful to look at other stuff besides, like, obviously MOBAs are great, but you can learn a lot by looking at other outside resources as well. So some quick callouts I would recommend here. Magic the Gathering, if you're familiar with that game, just as a viewer, has a really phenomenal podcast called Drive to Work by Mark Rosewater, who's their lead designer. I'd say some of the content can be hit or miss, but if you want like a recommendation from that standpoint, I would look particularly at his color theory, where he talks a lot about like what is like a blue card in the context of Magic, right? And like how does that capture the thematics and the mechanics, right? And how do those all integrate? That's a really, really useful resource that has a lot of overlap with what we're talking about here. So the color theory, color pie ones are phenomenal, and then some of the set design ones can also be really good. Although the less you know about Magic, the less useful those ones are. Other than that, there's another really good podcast that I really enjoy listening to called the Game Design Roundtable, which basically has a mix of video game and a lot of board game designers as well. And so you get a lot of different kind of cool outside perspectives on that kind of stuff as well. Game Maker's Toolkit is also a really good YouTube video series as well that I would also highly recommend. If again, just for focusing folks, he has a subset of the series called Boss Keys, which is looking at specifically sort of the breakdown of level design. He has a really phenomenal one on the Zelda series where he breaks down every temple and like everything from every Zelda game, and tries to look at how are they designed and how does the player feel and kind of interpret in that sense. So those would be some off the cuff, but there's a lot of actually really amazing design resources out there.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Of course, as I said, we're going to be getting into actually designing the champion and hopefully making the best use of all this. I think all of our brains are definitely, exploding from the sheer amount of information that's coming, but it's been absolutely tremendous. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll cross paths later on down the line. But for now, for any of you guys watching, we're not going to be sticking to necessarily a strict schedule with Champion Fortress because of with both myself and Exodus being shoutcasters and Roger's schedule being a little fluid as well. We're not going to stick to a specific one, but I will drop into the chat in a moment a link to our Discord, which will allow for you guys to get notified when we go live in the future, because this is the start of the new season. So we're going to hopefully do a ton more or similar things, and hopefully we'll have some other fantastic guests as well. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, Feral Pony. Exodus, Roger, was there anything which you wanted to shout out just before we go in a second?
Besides hire me, the other thing I would shout out is the 22nd to the 28th, we are returning with BCS, Belgian Charity Showdown. It is an streaming event for 1 week where we try to fundraise as much money for charity. We'll be dropping, take a look at Team 7am as well, because we're working very closely with them, as in organizing it with their management, actually. So please, for any people who want to donate, or just if you just want to come have a look and see what we're doing, 22nd to 28th of November. If you follow me on Twitter, I will definitely spam a lot of that stuff in the next upcoming month. So just so you know. Besides that, nothing else to plug.
From my side, I'm also new to in this group. I'm very happy to be here. I hope I did not disappoint so far. But what I tried to create, I tried to incorporate what we went along with. I tried to get like an image, an idea of what I think she could maybe hypothetically look like, something. And yeah, so far I just yeah, I will get better as we go along. So
No, it's been
I will get
fantastic.
faster
it's-
as we go along.
It's one of those ones where it is very helpful to have something that's sort of up as like a prompt for other dialogue or raising interesting questions. We had a lot of questions that sort of spawned from it, even in this very early stage, from both the mechanics and the design side.
No, fantastic job. Thank you so much, Roger. It's the first time coming out, but did a fantastic job. But that's all from us tonight. Again, we're looking to be coming back in the next couple of weeks, so do join up with that Discord to get pinged when we next go live, or you can follow on Champion Forge, at Champion Forge on Twitter. For now, that's all we've got, so we'll see you next time.